Thank you, Mrs Main, for calling me to speak in this debate, and I congratulate my honourable friend from Combe Valley for securing this debate in a very critical time for our public finances. Speaking as a Member of Parliament for the great city of Glasgow, it's a city with a fine tradition of what could be called municipal socialism, and it would be great to rediscover that municipal route to socialism. But it's something that has been under assault for many years now, under a decade-long, if not more, programme of austerity cuts in which local government has faced the brunt. And we often hear from members of the Scottish National Party in this place about how wonderful everything is in Scotland and how munificent the Scottish Government is at stewarding local government and dispensing the fruits of their excellent governance in Edinburgh to the rest of Scotland. And it couldn't be further from the truth. When I look at the dire straits in which Glasgow City Council finds itself in, I look at the last year in which Glasgow's had to find £40.9 million worth of cuts, and almost £20 million of that is a direct consequence of the Scottish Government's cuts to local government, and the remaining is due to pay and other inflationary pressures. It's clear that that is where the real brunt of the cuts from central government, both at Westminster and at Holyrood, are happening. They're happening on councils, and the result of that has been in Scotland 30,000 council jobs lost in recent years, which is a shameful indictment. The mass unemployment that we used to rail against in the 1980s with Thatcherite deindustrialisation has been writ large in local government by a Scottish Nationalist administration in Edinburgh. So between 2010 and 2018, Glasgow has lost £233 per head of the population spend in Scottish Government funding, and that's a real terms cut. That's the cost of the Scottish National Party to every single Glaswegian. And we also have seen a minority SNP administration take over the administration of Glasgow City Council since May 2017. What's happened is, instead of actually robust opposition to the onslaught of cuts that Glasgow has faced, we've seen meek acceptance and actually an attempt to divert and deny the reality of the fiscal constraints faced by Glasgow as Scotland's largest city, and a city with some of the greatest social constraints and greatest social problems in the country. Indeed, in my constituency, I've not just seen a failure in the quality of local services, a reduction in the cleansing services, the poor repair of the roads, the failure to help homeless people move into temporary accommodation, the decline in care services, the decline in social work services, the creeping effect that has on some of the weakest people in our society, those who disproportionately rely on those services. And we've seen that happen at a time when the SNP celebrated imposing a council tax freeze on local government. I'm happy to give way to my own friend from Rutherglen. I'll take you as well.
I thank. Does he agree with me that if local councillors are to be accountable to the people who elect them, it is absolutely essential that we protect the autonomy of local government to be able to raise their own funds, rather than give councillors this choice of worse or even worse cuts to make?
I thank my honourable friend for making that very pertinent point, and it goes to the heart of the issue of local government, one of structural decay over decades. Once we had great autonomous and highly vigorous municipal authorities. I mean, look at Glasgow. It used to run its own gas provision, electricity, tramways, railway system, subway system. It was a huge, huge enterprise, the Glasgow Corporation, and it's been slowly but surely torn apart over the last 50 years with creeping centralisation. This happened both at a regional level, but now with the dismantling of regional councils and regional authorities in Scotland, centralised into Holyrood. So one of the inadvertent effects of devolution over the last 20 years, and I argue a regrettable consequence, if an inadvertent consequence of devolution of the last 20 years, has been to essentially displace the municipal power of Glasgow in the west of Scotland and sucking that power into the east, into Edinburgh. And that's what we should guard against when we look towards constitutional reform across the United Kingdom and the city regions. We need to look at how that effective devolution, what it can have on the margins and on the periphery of that power base. And that's what I would like to see corrected in Scotland as we look forward to the next 2 decades of devolution. Yep, happy to give way.
Thank you very much for giving way. And Chair, I will be very brief this time. The councils are being forced, due to funding cut across the country, to sell their assets in order to fund the revenue budget. And does my honourable friend agree that this is not the way to fund and sell your assets and fund the revenue stream, these services?
I absolutely agree. Glasgow's in the absurd situation where it has a municipal car parking service. It must be the only car parking company in the world that now loses money every year. And there's not much of an overhead running a car parking service. But the reality is, as a result of the constraints on funding, and particularly the effort to try and resolve long-standing historical issues of equal pay disputes in local authorities, which is a national issue, the councils received no national support to deal with that historic issue. And as a result, the mechanism that they devised to do that was to essentially sell off their assets to arm's-length companies, mortgage those assets, and as a result of the credit crunch, a lot of these assets fell into negative equity, and as a result, the councils are paying off huge bills, in the case of Glasgow, to Barclays Bank, to service these financial constraints that have been imposed upon them. But also we have to look at the reality of council financing. My honourable friend from Rutherglen mentioned that point. You know, the reality of councils in Scotland is that over 80% of their funding is derived from central government grants. The reality is that the councils don't raise their own money. The very marginal yields are achieved from council tax and business rates. So the reality in Scotland is the bulk of it is controlled centrally. When the SNP have stopped the council's capacity to raise council tax through the council tax freeze, and also cut massively the budgets available to local authorities, that's going to really hammer the capacity to provide those services and then push councils into these destructive decisions as to selling off assets and mortgaging assets, which then just create a vicious cycle of decay and decline. Indeed, according to the Scottish Parliament's Information Centre, local government revenue budget in Glasgow was cut 6.9% from 2012-2013 to present, whereas the Scottish Government's own revenue budget fell by just 1.6% over the same period. So over the same period, indeed, Glasgow's cut, as opposed to the Scottish average, which was 6.9%, my apologies, Glasgow's budget has actually been cut 12.8%. It's actually an even greater cut to the local authority in the greatest need in Scotland. That's twice the average cut to Scotland's 32 councils, and a further 3.6% cut into Glasgow's planned this year. So while there's no question the Tories are to blame for handing the government in Edinburgh a cut of 1.6%, to multiply the percentage cut by 4 to 6.9% for councils and by 7 times in Glasgow is a deep injustice and flies in the face of any semblance of social justice or economic redistribution. And that's why it's a mockery when the Scottish National Party come to this place and profess to be the custodians of Labour's soul and the custodians of real socialist values. I find it absolutely absurd because it isn't the reality played out in the streets, in the towns and the cities of Scotland under their administration since 2007. That is the stark reality. Indeed, the only conclusion we can draw is that local government in Glasgow in particular has been targeted disproportionately for cuts, and in large part because for many years it was under Labour administration. So it was easy enough to pass the buck to a Labour administration, a Labour council, and blame them for having to administer the harsh choices and the harsh realities. And I will say this, that in many cases we were too keen to be the managers of that decline, rather than resisting it robustly. And I think we need to offer an apology, particularly to many of the women in Glasgow who suffered as a result of the failure to properly settle the equal pay dispute in Glasgow and have continued to militate against it. And have finally, as a result of a Court of Session ruling, have declared that they have actually been due over £500 million in historic pay injustice. That's the reality of what's happened, but it's not the fault necessarily of the design of councillors who are trying to do women out of a settlement. They've badly administered it and badly dealt with the reality of that problem, but the root cause of it lies in the destruction of the capacity of local councils to raise their own money, to deliver their own services, and to be masters of their own destiny. That is the brutal reality of what's happened. And I would like to offer, on behalf of the Labour Party, a profound apology to the women in Glasgow for the reality of what they've had to face over the last 10 years. Many of those women dying, waiting for that settlement. But the reality is, I think it was very much a sin of omission, not of commission. And that was the reality of us failing to properly challenge the decline in council services, the decline in council budgets. And we used the equal pay dispute in many ways to try and resolve it through selling of assets. But it was a flawed system, it was a flawed pay structure. We have to recognise that reality. But the root cause of that problem was because nationally we've failed to get a grip of local government reform. And that's a great flaw of devolution over the last 20 years, certainly in Scotland. And I hope in the next 20 years, when we look forward to the next 2 decades of devolution, we can right some of those injustices and properly re-establish decent municipal services and councils and city regions across Scotland. Because the story of devolution doesn't just end at Edinburgh, it doesn't just end in Holyrood, it has to continue on into the great towns and cities of Scotland and further develop it to a successful future.